There is something quietly unsettling about standing at the edge of the Adriatic Sea and watching a bridge disappear into the morning haze. Not because the bridge is gone, but because it is already cracking. 2 years, that is all it took. 2 years after the ribbon was cut, after the headlines about European unity and Croatian pride, after the champagne and the photographs and the speeches about a new chapter for the continent, the cracks began to show. Visible, on the pillars, above the sea. If you want to understand how the assumptions that hold the modern world together quietly come apart, subscribe. We document the fractures mainstream media calls minor and politicians call routine. This is not routine. This is a pattern, and it runs far deeper than concrete. The bridge in question is the Peljesac Bridge, built across the Bay of Molistan in southern Croatia. It is 2.4 kilometers long, a cable-stayed structure that rises over an arm of the Adriatic not far from Dubrovnik, one of the most photographed cities on Earth. The bridge opened to traffic in July 2022. It was celebrated as the most important infrastructure project in Croatia's modern history. And in certain respects, it genuinely was. For decades, a quirk of geography had split the Croatian coastline in two. A narrow strip of Bosnia and Herzegovina's territory near the town of Neum interrupted the road south, meaning that every Croatian citizen, every tourist heading to Dubrovnik, had to cross an international border just to stay within their own country. The Peljesac Bridge ended that. It connected the mainland to the peninsula, gave the south of Croatia continuous road access, and removed a border crossing that had become a symbol of national frustration. It was, by any measure, a genuine achievement. But how it was built, and who built it, and what happened 2 years later, is a story the press conference did not tell. To understand the full picture, you have to go back to September 2017. Croatia puts the bridge contract out to tender. 3 serious bidders emerge. Austrian construction giant Strabag submits an offer. An Italian-Turkish consortium involving Astaldi and Ichthys submits another. And then, from a company most Europeans had never heard of, comes a third bid. China Road and Bridge Corporation, a subsidiary of the Chinese state-owned conglomerate China Communications Construction Company, submits an offer of approximately 278 million euros. The Austrian bid comes in at around 351 million euros. The Italian-Turkish consortium at around 341 million euros. The Chinese offer undercuts both European competitors by more than 70 million euros and additionally promises to complete the project 6 months ahead of schedule. In January 2018, the Croatian Road Authority makes it official. China Road and Bridge Corporation wins the contract. It is the first time in history that a Chinese company has won the tender for a project funded by the European Union. Let that detail settle for a moment. The European Union, which contributed 85% of the project's cost, effectively financed a Chinese state-owned enterprise to build infrastructure on European soil. The budget, when all access roads and associated works were included, would eventually reach figures reported widely as approximately $650 million in total project cost. The EU's founding logic was always partly about strategic autonomy, about reducing dependencies, about building the continent from within. And yet here, in the Adriatic, European money flowed directly to Beijing's construction apparatus. The reaction was swift in certain quarters. Questions were raised immediately about whether the tender process had been designed with Chinese competition in mind, or whether European firms simply could not compete. Analysts noted with anxiety what this said about the industrial gap between European construction companies and Chinese state-backed giants. When CRBC can enter a European tender and undercut the continent's best firms by 70 million euros while promising faster delivery, the question is not whether the deal was legal. It was. The question is what the gap reveals about the structural competitiveness of European industry against an adversary that does not separate commerce from geopolitics. But set that question aside for now, because the construction itself carries its own story. China Road and Bridge Corporation is not a small operator. Across Africa, Latin America, Central Asia, and Eastern Europe, it has built highways, railways, ports, and bridges for decades. Its parent company, CCCC, ranks among the world's largest infrastructure contractors by revenue. The Peljesac Bridge was, in pure engineering terms, a formidable challenge. A marine conservation area, the salt and wind of the Adriatic, complex currents, extreme European structural standards. European Standard EN 1090-2, the execution Class 4 requirements for structural steel is extraordinarily strict. Welders required costly production control systems to verify concentricity, verticality, straightness. The documentation burden alone would have consumed enormous time under the original design sequence. CRBC adapted. It changed the proposed construction method, transporting prefabricated steel piles to the site aboard a COSCO shipping barge, described at the time as the largest pile-driving vessel in the world, a ship normally used for offshore wind platforms and oil infrastructure. During the critical installation phase, with COVID-19 disrupting local labor supply, more than 400 Chinese engineers and workers were flown to Croatia to complete the work. The main spans were joined in the middle at midnight on the 29th of July 2021, ahead of schedule. By July 2022, cars were crossing the Adriatic. Croatia had its bridge. If the story ended there, it would be a clean chapter about Chinese engineering ambition, European procurement rules, and geopolitical questions left politely unanswered. But stories like this never end at the ribbon cutting. By the autumn of 2024, reports began to emerge from the Italian newspaper Il Piccolo, cracks on the concrete pillars, visible from the outside. Within 2 years of the bridge opening to traffic, its structural pillars were showing surface fractures that required public explanation from Croatian authorities. The Croatian Road Authority moved quickly to reassure the public. The cracks, officials explained, were surface level, not structural. They did not affect the safety or stability of the bridge. They did not threaten the flow of traffic. They were consistent with normal concrete shrinkage in new structures, especially in the salt and wind environment of the Mediterranean. A civil engineering expert consulted by Croatian national television explained the mechanism clearly. Salt and wind push seawater into surface cracks, allowing salt to reach the steel reinforcement inside the concrete, which then corrodes, reducing the bridge's lifespan over decades if left unaddressed. The reassurances were technically credible. But two things stood out. First, the monitoring process for the bridge's condition had itself encountered delays. Croatian Roads confirmed it was collaborating with the Faculty of Civil Engineering, but the public procurement process for regular inspections had failed twice due to administrative appeals. A bridge opened in 2022 to great fanfare was entering 2025 without a functioning independent inspection contract. Second, the warranty clause embedded in the construction agreement meant that China Road and Bridge Corporation, the original contractor, remained obligated to address these defects under a 10-year warranty. The cracks, in other words, were now a problem for the contractor who built the bridge to resolve. A Chinese state-owned company was being called back to repair EU-funded infrastructure on European soil under sea air, with the clock running. By early 2026, Croatian authorities had confirmed that repair works were being planned. Officials from Hrvatski Ceste announced that the surface layer of concrete on affected sections would be removed down to the main reinforcement before being restored and additionally protected. The works were expected to begin in October 2026, after the tourist season, with completion targeted before the following summer. The salt and moisture that could enter through the cracks, one official explained, might over the next 20 to 30 years accelerate damage to the main reinforcement inside the bridge pylons if not addressed now. So here is the picture, assembled, an EU-funded bridge built by a Chinese state-owned enterprise to a budget that outcompeted all European rivals by a margin that raised structural questions at the time, showing visible cracks on its concrete pillars before it reaches its third birthday, requiring repair works that will disrupt traffic in one of Europe's most heavily visited tourist corridors, repaired under warranty by the same Chinese contractor that built it in the first place. None of this is presented as catastrophic by the authorities. And to be rigorous, the Croatian Road Authority's characterization of these as surface rather than structural cracks should be taken seriously. Engineers who study concrete behavior in marine environments are not surprised by this class of defect. Roman bridges still stand in Italy. The question is not whether concrete cracks. It always does. The deeper question is what this particular chapter reveals about the conditions that produce it. The pattern that runs through this story, the EU tender system that permitted the undercutting of European firms by a state-backed entity operating on terms that private companies cannot match, the procurement of speed at the possible expense of long-term durability in a saltwater environment, the delayed monitoring process, the warranty repairs being planned for a structure that is barely 3 years old in a tourist artery, connects to a set of forces that extend far beyond Croatia's coastline. What you have seen here, the gap in competitive capacity, the dependence embedded in the contract, the slow surfacing of consequences that were dismissed as unlikely at the signature ceremony, is only one face of a pattern that runs across every European institution, entering its period of structural questioning. I gathered the early warning signals most people miss, the disciplined framework for understanding what the decade ahead demands, into a guide called When Everything Falls. You can scan the code on your screen right now, or use the link waiting in the description below to find it. But stay here, because the final layer of this story is the one that the Croatian government, the European Commission, and Beijing would all prefer not to discuss in the same sentence. China Road and Bridge Corporation is not only the contractor who built the Peljesac Bridge, it is also the company that built the Pupin Bridge over the Danube in Belgrade, CRBC's first European project, opened in 2014 under Serbian and Chinese flags at a ceremony attended by China's then premier. It built segments of highways in Montenegro under a Chinese loan arrangement that became one of the most cited examples of Belt and Road fiscal risk in Europe, a project where the debt terms with Beijing raised serious sovereignty questions about what China could claim if repayments faltered, and it operates as a subsidiary of CCCC, a company sanctioned by the United States in 2020 for allegedly aiding the construction of Chinese military installations in the South China Sea. The company repairing the Peljesac Bridge under warranty is the same company operating across the European periphery as China's largest overseas infrastructure contractor, growing its market share at 16% a year, deliberately pricing below commercial viability in some markets simply to maintain presence, as insiders have noted, because keeping workers and equipment in position matters more than the margin on any individual project. That is not a commercial logic. It is a strategic one. When you understand CRBC not as a construction company that happens to be Chinese, but as a Chinese state instrument that happens to build construction, the cracks in the Adriatic take on a different texture. They are not evidence of Chinese engineering failure. They are evidence of something more subtle and more enduring. The slow integration of European infrastructure dependency into a web of relationships whose terms were written in Beijing, whose warranties are held in Beijing, and whose geopolitical implications will become visible not in 2 years, but in 20. Every empire has had its moment of architectural overreach. The road too long, the aqueduct too far, the fortification built by the hands of the people it was meant to keep out. Rome built Hadrian's Wall with the labor of the provinces it governed. Britain built railways across Africa and Asia that enriched London and left the infrastructure in foreign hands when the empire contracted. The pattern is not new. What changes is only the name of the empire and the sea it crosses. Croatia needed a bridge. Europe needed connectivity. China needed a market, a precedent, and a presence on the Adriatic. The bridge stands. The cracks are being repaired. The warranty is running. And somewhere between the first fracture on a concrete pillar and the final clause of a 10-year contract, something much harder to repair is quietly settling into place. Empires do not fall because of one crack in one pillar. They fall because nobody in the room wanted to be the one to ask what was behind it. If you want to keep watching the next patterns emerge before the explanations do, subscribe. The next chapter is already loading.